This time, Don Revie's Leeds United, a man who divides opinion, and that's just pronouncing his surname.
And it's no nay never, no nay never, no more, 'cause I'll stay a while over forever and more. And it's no nay never, no nay never, no more, 'cause I'll stay a while over forever and more.
Hello and welcome to By Far the Greatest Team, a podcast in which football fans attempt the seemingly impossible to work out just who is the greatest team of all time. Sometimes, like Francesco Totti resisting big money and glamour moves to stay at his beloved Roma, greatness is assured just through loyalty and commitment. Other times, Jordan Henderson gets a call from Saudi and a different fate awaits. My name's Graham Dunn, desperately searching glorious Oxford United wins at Ellen Road. They do exist. Step forward, Jim Magilton, please. And joining me, as ever, is Jamie Rooney, a man who had his very own Darren England moment on the pod a few weeks back with his Luton Town ranking. True great. Are you happy with that? True great. Ranking complete.
Did I really rank Luton Town as true greats? I mean, this is how I forget these things. I mean, I forget when we do on the recording. They were really true greats.
Luton Town were true greats. Were true greats. I think the VAR operator was quite surprised at that. So we're joined on this week's podcast by Philip Craig. Phil is back with us. We have let you out, Phil, from your normal, very tight northeast brief that we've been giving you. We're gradually expanding out of the Sunderland and surrounding areas.
Yeah, West Yorkshire.
Yeah, I don't get ideas above your station.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Well, it's not too far. It's just a relatively short distance down the M1, but in cultural terms, it's a chasm.
I don't think it's any big secret. There's obviously a very big link to the story we're going to talk about tonight, where Don Revie, however you pronounce it, and how he arrived at Leeds United. I'm sure Phil's got that covered. So the links are there for Sunderland already. We're getting Sunderland referencing ahead of Oxford United. I feel like this one's going to be a good one.
Yeah, of course, because we forget that I'm going to say Revie. I'm not sure why, but Don Revie was a player for Sunderland before he ever became a manager. And then, of course, there's the famous cup final loss in 1973, whereas something of a nemesis, Bob Stokoe, comes along and the Sunderland team beats his great Leeds team as well.
It's all written. It's all written. It is an interesting one. Don Revie. I think I always used to say Don Revie. I say that because, of course, I've not had cause to even think about how I pronounce Don Revie for about 25 years. I'm not even sure I ever really had an opinion on it. But I think what probably gives you some weight there, Phil, is that Revie was from your neck of the woods, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was born and brought up in Middlesbrough, which is, well, practically Yorkshire if you're from Sunderland. But yeah, he was born and brought up in Yorkshire and didn't really properly leave the county of Cleveland, really, until he was a young player and he got the opportunity to play for Leicester City. And he actually had a particularly successful career as a player. And as a playmaker as well, in kind of modern terms, I guess he was something of a false nine or a false 10. He'd kind of play off the centre forward and create space for him, famously for Manchester City in an FA Cup final as well. So he had a great deal of kind of tactical nous even before he stepped into the football management game.
So I would be inclined, because you're from the same neck of the woods, to go with Revie. I think probably what really needs to take a call on this is whether you're a Bowie or Bowie man, Phil.
I'm a boy. I've got to say I'm a boy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Is that the right way?
I think that's the right way, surely. Jamie, where do you stand on either Bowie, Revie?
I think I would say David Bowie, and I think I've always been saying Don Revie. Yeah. There's no Revin in my Revie.
Of course, when we look at football pronunciations, I think there is the one which stands out as the greatest pronunciation dilemma of them all. And that, of course, is go back to 1986 and Mick Shannon adopting the Gary Lineker for Gary Lineker, which I think is probably head and shoulders there. Probably the big difference between Revie and Lineker is Revie was probably more of a kind of Brexit-like 52-48 kind of split, whereas I think Mick Shannon was literally the only person who called Gary Lineker.
There is a brilliant clip of that as well with Brian Moore when I think it's a 1986 World Cup where Mick Shannon is doing his Gary Lineker, and Brian Moore is, on live television as a pundit is trying to coach him through pronouncing it, your boy Lineker. And then Mick Shannon's got back and he's like, yeah, that's what I mean, Lineker. I said it right that time, didn't I, Brian? And then Brian Moore goes straight away, no, you didn't. It's live television. It's putting him straight in his place.
Oh, that's definitely up there. I do remember, I think football pronunciation, I don't know if there are any football pronunciations wrong or right that occur to you. There was one I used to struggle with. As a youngster, I picked as my Scottish team. This was in the days when you had to have a Scottish side as well as an English side. And for reasons unbeknown to me, I chose the mighty St Mirren. As you can see, I've not been cursed with successful sides on either side. But yes, I went for St Mirren, and they had this free scoring player who used to play for them. I used to see his name on the score sheet when you looked at the Sunday papers the following day or whatever, and it was this chap called McKeveny, which I kind of couldn't. And then it turned out that was Frank McAvenny, which is a much better way of pronouncing it, isn't it? It's quite obvious that it's McAvenny when you can see it.
I think pronunciations or mispronunciations has become quite a feature for you and I, Graham, on these podcasts. I mean, after I made a complete pig's ear of the city in Germany of Gelsenkirchen, I think I actually pronounced it right then, but I have been practicing. But I think it is Gelsenkirchen, which I can't say Gelsenkirchen without having like a Cornish twang at the end.
I think you do a better job of that than you did with Salford.
Yes, Salford United, that great team owned by Gary Neville.
The irony of me making fun of people's pronunciations when I failed to get two of the last three guests we've had on this programme, on this podcast, I've managed to fail to get their names right. I'm not sure I can talk. Any pronunciations or mispronunciations stand out for you, Phil?
No, I just feel like in all the preparation I did for this, the one thing I didn't look into was the Revie. So I'm feeling a bit exposed now, and all of a sudden I want to kind of go back to this damned United and to those excerpts and the interviews that they included as part of that, and try and revisit exactly what it was. I mean, I guess as a Sunderland supporter, I do struggle with the amount of, some of the French pronunciations of vast majority of many of our players. Not easy to have a chant in Sunderland about some of the players.
Yes, that does become increasingly challenging. Well, enough of such nonsense. We're going to get on. We are talking about Don Revie's Leeds United. It's a really special story, this one, I think. And one of the things about it is he's probably one of the most misunderstood or somebody whose reputation is probably most tarnished over the years. And this is a guy who basically, his reputation got absolutely trounced for doing, something that Roberto Mancini did last month, leaving the national team to take for a money job. But it means, I think, there's a lot in his story is a bit underrepresented or kind of forgotten. I think what I had totally misunderstood was that actually, because in the whole time I've sort of followed football, Leeds were a team. I became kind of football conscious, aware the late 70s, and Leeds were a big name. My brother used to support Leeds. They had a kind of reputation about them. And then during the 80s, they win the league. And then it's always about these fallen giants, Leeds. But before Revie, there's virtually no Leeds, is there, Phil?
Yeah, there's practically no great footballing heritage about Leeds before Don Revie. So in Leeds, you had rugby league and cricket. They were by far the favourite sports. And as a parallel, if you look at some of the attendances for the football matches, for the first Don Revie game, the first home game in charge in March 1961 against Sheffield United, Ellen Road had 13,688 attendees. And actually the home attendance sometimes fell to as low as 10,000 people, which is a big issue for the club because the club needed 30,000 approximately to break even. If you compare that with the rugby league team, they were getting nearer to 50,000 supporters. So it was very much a rugby league, cricket, obviously we think of Yorkshire and the county team, rather than football. And he took over not only an unglamorous job, but he was taking over a club that was practically near to bankruptcy. They were getting pretty close. There seemed to be in the history a number of sometimes quite convenient fires that took place at certain times without defaming anybody, I hope, but it's raised a few eyebrows in the press at the time. And this unglamorous football club decided to take a punt on a very good player, somebody who probably should have played more games for England, quite a successful player, certainly at a kind of club level over a number of different clubs. They took a punt on him, to be honest.
You touched on it, Phil, that actually he was quite a progressive footballer as well. And I think there was one club that actually took him and built the team around him. It was a kind of the Revie plan or something.
Yeah, I think if you go back to the Manchester City team, he had a number of kind of, I suppose, slightly false start. He had some good success at Leicester City before going to Hull City. The idea about going to Hull City was that he saw as a kind of a mentor as well as a coach, Reg Carter. Reg Carter, of course, he was part of the successful Sunderland team, and obviously coming from the northeast, he would have known Reg Carter very well. Reg Carter was a complete antithesis to what he expected. He thought he'd be a kind of inspirational leader, and Reg Carter would say hardly anything. He'd just try and lead, for example, on the pitch as a player manager. And it was only when he kind of got to Manchester City and McDowell was the manager that they kind of came across this new formation, which, and this could be a theme actually throughout his career, that he and his approach to football was very much ahead of the game. He would basically play as a false nine and step back and create space. He'd essentially kind of pull back towards between kind of the forward line and midfield, pull the defenders towards him, and create space for players around him, especially the kind of progressive wingers around him. And for a time when he was at Man City and before he eventually kind of went on to Sunderland, Manchester City were, if perhaps not the best team in the country, then certainly one of the best teams in the country.
Yeah, it's quite a story. In fact, and in some ways, there's a kind of he didn't have the kind of international levels. I'm not sure he ever played for England, did he? But another of the themes that will kind of emerge with him is the connection with Brian Clough throughout his career, and his career isn't drastically different from Brian Clough's career, right?
Yeah,
is it?
That's right. I suppose he did play for England, but only 6 times. But he scored 4 goals, so he didn't really get the chances that he deserved. Partly out of favour, partly due to injury. Brian Clough was, again, in a similar position when he was at both Middlesbrough. He actually kind of played for Middlesbrough as well as Sunderland. He was a hugely successful striker, but he also eventually ended his career because Clough had a knee injury, a cruciate knee injury, which he just never recovered from. The type of injury which today would have put players' careers in doubt at the time would just destroy their kind of careers. So they must have known each other beforehand. They were both from Middlesbrough. They both played for Sunderland. And then, of course, their career trajectories as coaches start to kind of collide, famously.
So it's his first job, isn't it? And you're absolutely right. He takes over as player manager at Leeds. He's already at Leeds, and he takes over as player manager March 1961. And I mean, I think he was probably the cheap option, wasn't he? I think we describe him as the cheap option now. The suggestion is that he applied for a manager's job somewhere, maybe Bournemouth, and he basically asked for a reference, and they wrote it up and thought, oh, why don't we give him the job?
Yeah, and this is probably the last time that Don Revie was ever considered a cheap option, because certainly as a player and later as a manager, it was suggested that sometimes he'd use the threat of leaving a football club to try and negotiate a better package. In fact, I think I paraphrase slightly, but it was once said that the Revie said one way to judge the success of a career was by looking at the player's bank balance. Which then fed into the myth or the reality that somehow he was he was very much money dominated. That money kind of played a significant role in some of the decisions that he made, including, of course, when he was England manager.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that kind of theme comes to dominate his whole sort of career. That opening stage, so Leeds very nearly get relegated in his first year, doesn't he? I think he keeps them up they're in the second tier, as we like to call it. But actually, he has a remarkably quick effect on that team, doesn't he?
Yeah, he did. He certainly took over a struggling club, but within a very short period of time, he'd managed to basically take a struggling club and mould largely a team of youngsters into probably one of the most formidable clubs in Europe. So Leeds get promoted from the second division as champions in 1963-64 season. And then over the course of the next decade, over the next 10 years, together they win 2 league championships, 2 Fairs Cups. In fact, Leeds were the first British club to win the Fairs Cup, an FA Cup and a League Cup. It was in 1969 that Leeds actually won the league championship for the first time. This is quite a significant breakthrough, not just for Leeds, but they also set a points record for the first division, a points record that had stood for 38 years. They won the league with 67 points. And the kind of comparison I would have would be something similar maybe to Manchester City today or Arsenal, the Invincibles. They weren't quite the Invincibles, but between October 68 and the end of the season, so the 34 games, they were unbeaten. And in fact, they went through an entire season unbeaten in 1968-69. So they were, along with a few other clubs, the Leeds, the Manchester Uniteds, the Arsenals, also other teams like Manchester City, they were right up there. And also right up there, not just in terms of domestic football, but also the kind of European football. So even before they'd won the league title in 65, in the first season back in the first division, they finished runners-up on goal average in those days in the first division, and they lost the FA Cup final.
With that runners-up on goal, it's because we call it goal difference. I think back in the day it was called goal average, which is beautiful, isn't it? But they were the first top-tier team to reach 60-plus points and not win the title. Such was the bar that was set when they did lose out on goal average to Matt Busby's Manchester United.
Which is an incredible achievement in the first season in the top tier, which, as Phil mentioned, I mean, they came within a whisker. It came within a whisker of doing the double. I mean, that's extraordinary. FA Cup final and missing out on goals in your first season in the league. Now, it is a kind of thing that we have, and I'm not going to spend the entire thing making parallels to Brian Clough, but there is another parallel here, isn't there, to how Nottingham Forest how Nottingham Forest did in the first season, because it seems so bizarre for a team to get promoted and win the top tier now, when it would just be. I'm saying this, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty confident that Burnley aren't going to win the league this year. So obviously it's become even more extreme. But even that, to jump up a league, go to the top tier and almost do the double, and in fact go on a run pretty much unprecedented. I don't think they finish outside the top 4 for his entire reign or so.
Yeah, I mean, in 66, again, runners-up in the league. 67, they lost in the semi-finals of the FA Cup. What's perhaps the most remarkable is, in a period where it was kind of quite unusual to win the treble, they came really, really close. And this is probably a little bit of a theme through the podcast in terms of, yes, great, but true great, when they fell a little bit short. It seems a little bit churlish to kind of say that, but in 1970, they came close to achieving the treble, only to fall quite tragically on all 3 fronts. They had a highly congested kind of close season. They finished second in the league to Everton. They lose the 1970 FA Cup final to Chelsea after a replay. and they exit the European Cup with a semi-final defeat to Celtic, who, of course, went on to become European champions. And then again in 1972-73, they again came close to the treble. Their league campaign tailed off. Again, a very similar story in terms of fixture congestion and injuries. They finished third, 7 points behind Liverpool. They, of course, reached the 1973 FA Cup final, but faced Sunderland and defeated 1-0.
Did they?
I had to just throw that one in. And, of course, there's another very good podcast about that, isn't there? Famously, if you can look back on some of the commentary on the TV, and Brian Clough at the time said, Brian Clough of all people remarked that there is no way Sunderland can beat Leeds, but of course Leeds lost 1-0. And they also lost the final of the European Cup Winners' Cup against AC Milan. They were beaten 1-0 when there were some rather controversial refereeing decisions made. Norman Hunter was sent off after he was fouled by one of the Italian players. So it's kind of quite tragic, really, isn't it? They came so close to the kind of greatness that probably we think of now in current terms of.
We referenced the Spurs-Liverpool VAR situation, and another of them is 70-71, where Leeds miss out by a point. So there's only 1 point in that game. They lose this crucial game to West Bromwich Albion with this unbelievable Jeff Astle offside goal, which basically everyone stopped. So I will put a link in on the social. It's fantastic. It's weird watching it again now, because actually you think, oh, there's nothing wrong with this. The guys, because the West Brom player kind of is running from inside his own half. So you think, oh, that's fine. And you can see a player standing a good 20 yards offside, but he's not interfering with play. But then, of course, you think, oh, hang on, no, this is 1971. He's offside. He's clearly offside. Everyone stops. The ref then allows it to carry on. It's tapped in Jeff Astle, the simplest goal, and that's the crucial point they miss it out by. It's brilliant. If only we've talked on some previous pods about some of the great commentaries. This has some brilliant Barry Davis commentary. Features the line, Leeds, we mad at this, and they've every right to be. There's no sitting on the fence. He is so scandalized. Everyone is so scandalized by this referee's call. So, I think out of the long list of games that would be replayed under Jurgen Klopp's rule, I think that one would be pretty much high up. But it's another example of how many close finishes and how many close, it's a really impressive run, and by far Leeds' most bejeweled period of trophies, but it could have been so much more.
I feel like it's just going to lead to a question for you, actually, but it's a bit of a preamble, just to kind of really try to understand why they came so close. Because, you're absolutely right. What we're talking about here is Don Revie. We're talking about Leeds United, but it is very much Don Revie's Leeds United, and it is Leeds United in their only period in history where they have really been a major force in English football. Nothing really before, one championship afterwards under Harold Wilkinson. And Revie's there for as we talked about, he's the 13th season, and his first season, as we mentioned, he saves the club from going into the third tier. And then 2 seasons later, he gets the team promoted. So he's got 10 seasons in the top flight. And as Phil absolutely rightly said, they never finish outside the top 4 in those 10 seasons. It's pretty incredible. And they're 5 times they're runners-up, 2 league championships, 5 times they're runners-up. And what's incredible about that, they're runners-up to 5 different football teams. It's not the same team pegging them. It's actually Manchester United, Liverpool, Everton, Arsenal, and in 1971-72, Derby County. So they've dominated, but they haven't really got over the line. So Phil, with Revie's reputation, there's so much there to unpick. I mean, we haven't even started on the superstitions right now, but there was an idea that Don Revie was so meticulous and so driven by success, his fear of defeat was greater than his drive for success. And do you think the reason why there isn't more league championships attached to this fantastic football team was maybe that the fear of defeat for Revie was just a bit too great on those occasions when they could have and should have got over the line?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's both. I think it's both a strength and a weakness. So it's a strength, probably most famously, in that Revie would ask his kind of coaches to spend the weekend before a game seeing the opponent. And they would come back and they would produce the famous dossiers. There'd been opposition research that had taken place before, but nothing to the extent of Leeds United, where a lengthy dossier was prepared on opposing teams so that every single player would know every detail about the opposition. And the objective was that you were able to kind of exploit the weaknesses and nullify the threats of the opposition. And in fact, in practice matches with the reserves would be playing much like the opposition that Leeds would be playing the following Saturday. They would adopt very much the same style. And that would extend into some of the things that we take for granted now with the kind of the data-driven approach to football, so that an individual player's game would be broken down into quarters, and there'd be details in terms of how many passes or how many tackles that individual would have. And then that would feed through into the kind of the coaching. Now, there were certainly players who bought into the process, and there were some players who probably surprised themselves as much as anything to be bought into the process. Jack Charlton, famously, who Revie, before he became Leeds manager, when he played against an opposition that thought was the worst of the worst, and took a rather relaxed approach to football, certainly before Revie came, was turned into a journeyman centre-back in 1961 to a World Cup winner in 1966. So even Jack Charlton, with a raised eyebrow, would suggest that Revie had an influence, and to some extent the dossiers played a role in that. But most players bought into it. Some players maybe bought into it more than others. There was certainly some kind of quizzical looks from opposition players when they found out the type of level of detail that was taking place, because I guess the suggestion was that you were focusing so much on the opposition and their strengths and weaknesses, you weren't necessarily kind of focusing on your own game. And in the process of going through the dossiers, it could perhaps lend itself to being slightly kind of negative as well, and maybe fed into that kind of view that, Leeds would go 1-0 up, sit on the lead, and that would be the end of it. It was quite formulaic, I think, the approach as well. If you think about all of the teams, all of the players in the Leeds United teams throughout the 1960s into the 1970s, there's a kind of a core group of 8 players who kind of get it and buy into it. But of course, it could be difficult for new players to kind of come into it. And if they don't buy into it, they just weren't going to kind of get anywhere, I think. So overall, looking at it, I actually thought it was more of a strength than a weakness, because lots of the things that that Revie ended up doing, including the dossiers, including the focus on fitness as well. He famously brought in a doctor from London for pre-season to kind of run through the exercises with the team. That's not something that's properly illustrated in this Damned United, but I think they were probably one of the fittest teams in the league.
Yeah, and it's true that his attention to detail was there from the very beginning, because when he took over as the player manager and then got his feet under the carpet when he kind of secured Leeds in the second division onwards to promotion, he made a lot of changes. He ensured that the team travelled in first class. So did away with like the third class travel. He organised making sure that they had the best boots, the best training kits. He created a family culture, and he most famously, as the story goes, although there are a few different versions of this, but I think I like to believe that Don Revie is responsible for why Leeds United play in the all-white kit, and that's because he had a bit of a love affair with Real Madrid. They were dominating football at the time. He wanted Leeds to be the dominating force, so he changed the gold and blue that Leeds were playing in into the classic all-white that they're famous for.
I mean, it is extraordinary when you look at it now. You have some football managers, in fact, probably most football managers in the Premier League today, who don't even have any control over the players they sign. And Don Revie was able to change their kit. Oh, and do you know what? We're going to change your badge.
The owl and the superstition.
The superstitions are fantastic. Go on, Phil. What happened with this badge?
Well, Revie thought that birds were an unlucky omen, so he decided that the owl would be changed. They would change the badge, but that was just one of his superstitions. I mean, famously, he was kind of quite obsessed by gypsies. He believed it was bad luck if you ever turned away a gypsy from the door. And in fact, after the team came close but failed to land a trophy in 1967, he brought in a gypsy to lift what he believed was a curse that had been placed on Ellen Road. So there'd be no bad luck for the following 67-68 season. There were smaller things as well. So he tended to wear the same overcoat. He had a lucky blue suit. He carried a rabbit foot in his pocket as well. And all of these issues have been kind of confirmed both by players, but also by his own daughter as well, has kind of written about this as well. He was so really analytical through his dossiers, hugely prepared for every single game, but at the same time, kind of quite a complex personality, massively superstitious.
The two just don't go hand in hand, do they? I mean, either you like Jamie here and you believe in the data, or you're a proper football man and you don't have anything to do with that, and you probably go down the superstition route. They are brilliant, those superstitions, aren't they, Jamie?
Yeah, they are. I always remember, here I am making Man United references, Graham. I'm trying to compete with you, Oxford United. But I always remember when Liverpool legend Paul Ince was playing for Manchester United, he had this superstition where he had to be the last player out of the team tunnel and he had to put his shirt on as he walked onto the pitch. I mean, he was a young, fit guy in his 20s, and I'm sure getting his torso out wasn't part of the appeal for a man who doesn't really seek that much attention. But yeah, the superstitions are quite bizarre. But one of the superstitions I did like, and I think there's something about Paul Madeley as well in terms of his shirt numbers, but what Don Revie liked was to put the right players in the right shirt numbers. And this is a bit of a topic we've had in the last few pods where strangely players who are playing in positions are wearing shirt numbers that they shouldn't be wearing. Asamoah Gyan, who we spoke about a few pods ago, wearing number 3 as a striker. William Gallas as a central defender, wearing number 10. Don Revie had suspicions with shirt numbers, but at least he was playing players relatively in the right position to their shirt numbers.
On shirts, interestingly, he was an early proponent for having sponsorship on shirts, even before we kind of take it for granted now. But he also famously, in a European tie, to confuse the opposition, I think it was against AC Milan, he actually kind of got the players to wear different numbers to what they would normally wear. So the opposition would think, kind of would be confused by what was happening. I think that was in the 66 Intercity Fairs Cup against Torino, where they all came out with unfamiliar numbers to try and confuse the Italian club's really tight man marking system. I'm surprised that's not something that's kind of done now to this day.
I think it's a great idea. I think that definitely works. It's interesting. I mean, as you say, footballers and superstitions, there's no sort of a shortage of them, and we can go on for a while. And I definitely welcome any of these. Please contact us on the social channels if you have any that you enjoy. I was struck by the similarities with recent owner Massimo Cellini, who had a problem with the number 17, which he thought was disastrously unlucky. And from the moment he could do, 17 was removed from the squad numbers of Leeds United whilst he's there. But there's definitely something strange that someone as analytical took such an analytical approach as Don Revie would also add this extra bit of insurance of bringing a rabbit foot or not changing his suit.
Yeah, he's a very complex man. The more that you read about him, I think the more sympathetic I became. So you're right, he is very analytical. He's a disciplinarian, but he's also incredibly superstitious. He's quite emotional. He forms very close bonds with the players. He's considered by many of the players, including, say, people like Billy Bremner, to be more of a kind of a father figure as a manager. And that didn't quite extend into his time as an England manager, but it did for some players. Kevin Keegan, for example, spoke very highly about Revie as a manager, but also as a coach and mentor, and helped him to kind of get through some difficult times as a New England international in some of his first games. And, it's kind of remarkable. There was a nice story that made me kind of chuckle about the closeness between him and the players. It relates to all people, Norman Hunter, who in his younger days wasn't as actually kind of beefy and strong as he was as a player we remember in the late 60s, but he was told by Revie to strengthen his physique, and to do that by every morning drinking a raw egg washed down with a glass of Harvey's Bristol cream. Now, Hunter did this, even though on the odd occasion it made him throw up. But Revie told him to do it, so he did it.
It is extraordinary. Norman Hunter was one of kind of a number of youngsters who came through that period as well. And Peter Lorimer, Paul Madeley. So Peter Lorimer was probably one of the big names that came through there. But Norman Hunter is also, I guess, Norman Hunter, Billy Bremner, Johnny Giles, real kind of engine room of this side. But there were two things I was expecting, and I was kind of running a book which you were going to mention first, Phil. Were you going to mention the Sunderland 1973 FA Cup final, or were you going to say Dirty Leeds?
Yeah, and obviously I came in with the 1973. Nothing if not obvious, really, to be honest. You're right. There was. It's interesting in the research you go through. You can develop rather a long list of examples of foul play. So I won't go through everything, but 1965, Leeds are back in the first division. The players are ordered from the pitch when there's a brawl breaks out against Everton. 65 again. Bobby Collins, who was the original hard man in the middle of midfield, he breaks the collarbone of Liverpool's Jerry Byrne. Later on, in a semi-final of the FA Cup, there's a head-to-head between Bremner and Pat Crerand. And there's a famous picture of Dennis Law from that match as well, with this kind of torn shirt as well. Became kind of quite totemic as well. You can kind of go on and on. 1967, Bremner was sent off for kicking the goalkeeper while he was shielding the ball, and he was banned for 2 weeks, fined £100. Gary Sprague was sent off in 1968 in an FA Cup game for punching a Bristol City player. There you go. So there's any kind of number of... 1970 was a bit of a favourite against Chelsea. Jack Charlton kneed and headbutted Peter Osgood to the floor, but he was only booked for that. And it was only in the 85th minute when Ian Hutchinson of Chelsea shoved Billy Bremner to the floor. All hell broke out. There were all kinds of punches. That was the bar for being kind of sent off. But, I got a better understanding, I think, looking back, in terms of they felt, I think, to get out of the second division, that they needed to be disciplined and tenacious and aggressive. And, to be honest, you probably did need to be like that to get out of the second division. But even in the first division, they weren't the only club that was adopting a much more kind of physical style and being very hard to beat. They were definitely a strong and physical team. But then lots of other clubs also had their own kind of hard men as well. It wasn't just Norman Hunter. You just had to look after yourself. And other clubs would have, say, for example, Ron Chopper Harris at Chelsea, or Peter Storey at Arsenal, or Ron Yates at Liverpool. All were known to varying degrees in terms of that kind of hard man, quite often in midfield, who could do a little bit of damage.
Well, I can't believe I am going to say this, but I am going to say this because I sincerely mean it. I think the tag Dirty Leeds, although Phil's just gone through quite a resume of incidents, I think the tag of Dirty Leeds has been attached to Leeds rather unfairly, and I think. I mean, the research is a bit. I think the Everton game that Phil talks about, the league game where the players are taken off, the referee takes the players off mid-game. I never heard of anything like this in my life. For 10 minutes for both the players and the fans to calm down. I mean, it would be fantastic to see that on Super Sunday on Sky Sports. It would be. But I think something happens before that match. So Leeds, when they were in the second tier in the 62-63 season, the 63-64 season, the Football League had started comprising a journal of disciplinary yellow and red cards because they were a fairly new innovation. So they were compiling a journal. And at the end of that 63-64 season, Leeds United were top. But it wasn't just the first team. It was representative of all teams that fell under the umbrella of Leeds United or Manchester United or Sunderland or Oxford United. So right down to the junior teams, disciplinary was being added to this rolling target. And Leeds weren't the most ill-disciplined team in Division 2 at that particular time. but they were collectively by their group of teams. And then the Football League Journal asked the question, is this the dirtiest team you could ever play? So the idea has been baked in. And then soon after that, you get the Everton scenario that Phil's talked about. And then the things start snowballing in an era of physicality. And I think I kind of blame, totally unfairly, Tim Lovejoy as well for the Dirty Leagues tag. So Tim Lovejoy, obviously he's on our television sets on a regular basis, but he started off on Soccer AM. We probably remember Soccer AM. It was groundbreaking at the time. You know, Saturday morning TV, you get up and you just watch endless pieces of football fun. And he would, week in, week out, on this live television channel on a Saturday with a very big peak audience, introduce Leeds as Dirty Leeds, always Dirty Leeds. So I think the notion of Dirty Leeds was kind of rebaked into the British psyche. So I feel like I want to defend Leeds because I think they were doing nothing any different to most teams were doing in the 60s and 70s, as Phil's rightly pointed out. And I think to carry on and have this stigma attached to them is really unfair, albeit they don't help themselves sometimes.
I think this fed into a little bit of a persecution complex as well with Revie and Leeds, that actually there was unfair criticism of Leeds. There was an anti-Leeds agenda, not just in terms of the media, but also because of the FA. And that anti-Leeds agenda was actively encouraged by other clubs and rivals as well. So there'd be accusations of being negative or over physical, for example. And of course, mostly they had the Dirty Leeds. It's not to say, of course, that they didn't play their part in many of the most famous incidents of the time. It just occurred to me that it was actually after, I think, Revie had become England manager, but there's that famous incident in the Charity Shield in 1974, I think it was, when, again, quite interestingly, Johnny Giles was booked for throwing a punch at Kevin Keegan. He was only booked for that. I can't believe he was only booked for it, but it was then the brawl with Bremner where they were both sent off. It ended in the red card is kind of quite remarkable. It became one of those iconic pieces of football TV from the early 70s.
I think that side that won the league 68, 69, I think it was, is worth just talking about a bit more again, if only because, I mean, it was an extraordinary run, a points record and performance that would be, not bettered for many years. And I think if I read correctly on this, that Revie essentially got fed up of coming second and had sort of worked out he was being spread too thinly across tournaments. So on that one, I think I don't know if it's been added retrospectively, but there's this idea that he decides in that season to focus on the title. And in focusing on it, he absolutely storms it.
Yeah, I think that was right. There's definitely any number of seasons where, I guess it's the days that we forget now where, there wasn't a semi-final with extra time and penalties. There was replay, and there was replay after replay. And Leeds, because of their success, were competing in the first division. They could well be kind of competing through the League Cup, the FA Cup, European football, could be the Fairs Cup. It could be the European Cup later after they become league champions. And they would depend consistently on a relatively small number of players throughout the time that Revie was manager. And understandably, if you were, there were players who could step in, but if you lost, interestingly enough, very early on, the key player, even before Bremner kind of came into his own, was probably Bobby Collins, who he'd signed from Everton. Bobby Collins was probably the original hard man in the centre of midfield before the likes of Bremner and Giles were able to kind of come through. He ends up getting injured. He probably imparted a few injuries on other players, but he ends up getting injured himself, slowly comes back.
He gets injured in that game against Torino with a tackle. I haven't seen it, but a tackle that it is appalling, apparently. And I think the clue that it is appalling is that he gets a broken thigh. Now that broken thigh bone is quite, there's over the top of the ball, and then over the top of the knee is quite something.
That's bad, isn't it? Yeah, it is particularly bad. So Revie he was obviously successful in the Intercities Cup, but I think his dream, having become league champions, was to win the European Cup. And of course, Manchester United and Celtic did that. They were successful in doing that. Leeds came close, but only after Revie has left the club, but fall short. Yeah, I think looking back, Revie would have loved to have not just won the League Cup, the FA Cup, but also the European Cup as well, and be on an equal level with the great Celtic and Manchester United teams.
Graham, I think going back to your point, I think there is some truth in Don Revie taking his foot off the pedal in terms of trying to compete across every tournament in that season. So if you look at the two previous seasons before that league championship in 68-69, they finished fourth in the league. They reached the FA Cup semi-final in both of those two previous seasons. So they've gone deep into that tournament. In the 67-68, they're runners-up in the League Cup. And in both of the two seasons, they get to the Intercities Fairs Cup final. So that they've pretty much tried to compete in all four tournaments. Yet in the 68-69 season, you're absolutely right. They win the league. They're out of the FA Cup in the third round. They're out in the League Cup in the fourth round. And they don't go that deep in Europe as well. So they really have the league to focus on. But I think Revie is, as you've already rightly pointed out, I think he was already focused on that, because I think in their first 9 games, they win 7, they draw 2, they lose a couple of games early on. And after that, they just go on an amazing unbeaten run to secure the league championship, to a point where they can take their foot off the pedal towards the end when they're out of all the other tournaments, and they end up drawing quite a few because they've just got such a big winning margin in that particular season.
He was so light years ahead. He was light years ahead in football scouting and the dossiers. He was also light years ahead in playing weakened teams in the domestic cup competitions. It is interesting. Now, across his hugely successful period, he is tempted, or there is talk of him moving a couple of times to other jobs. I think there was an offer, a potential job at Birmingham, and a possible job at Everton in '73, I think it was. And that does sort of play into this narrative that perhaps Don Revie always had an eye on either other jobs or other ways of earning money, perhaps.
Yeah, I suppose. Again, I think it might be unfair in that he's a highly successful football manager. Look at his success from today. It's not surprising that other clubs would have an interest in him, both domestic clubs and also international clubs as well. So Torino, Juventus and others were making offers long before he became England manager, and there was the lure of money from the United Arab Emirates. There was always a hint or a suggestion that at the point at which there was a contract negotiation to be made, that the rumour would kind of go out that there was an interest in him. That's certainly true. Whether that's true or whether that's not true, I don't think anybody kind of really knows. I think it's something he inherited from when he was a player, and there's probably more in it at that point. And of course, after he became England manager as well, and he took the money to go, it played into it. My own feeling is that he always had a very, very strong emotional attachment to Leeds. And while he was well paid and well looked after, I don't think there was ever a serious likelihood of him leaving until he got the offer of the England job.
And the England job is where he goes to. And I think it's fair to say the legacy from that is not great for either Leeds United or Revie himself, or in fact England.
Yeah, he obviously inherited a club which has just failed to kind of qualify for the World Cup. And he has a mixed set of results as England manager. England failed to qualify for the Nations Cup and are on the brink of disqualification in the qualifiers for the next World Cup in Argentina, when he's offered the job of manager and coach in the United Arab Emirates. I think, to be fair to him, he inherited maybe a team with some qualities, but not the same quality that we'd had previously. I think it certainly was nowhere near as good as the team that Ramsey had developed. And indeed, Ramsey failed to qualify in 1974 with that team as well. But also, I think some of the attributes that he took to the manager's job as a Leeds manager just didn't translate into the England job. The emotional attachment he had with the players, you just couldn't ever get as a national team manager when you'd see them, every now and again rather than on a day-by-day basis. The ability to kind of enforce some of the disciplines that he'd had, including the dossiers, just wasn't there, I think, as well. And I think Revie would definitely kind of look at contrast the control he had when he was at Ellen Road compared to the lack of control he had, and some of the interference, I think, as he saw it from the kind of the bureaucracy and the hierarchy in the FA, questioning some of his decisions and his kind of team selections as well. It's just something he was never used to and bridled against, and probably ultimately ended up with some of the acrimony that kind of followed after he went to the United Arab Emirates as well.
I suppose we were lucky that England played in white shirts to begin with, so he didn't have to try and change those. But yes, it's
yellow.
A completely different, different level of control, and it does. And obviously, it's the manner in which he's clearly pretty disenchanted. And there's a suggestion that England are already trying to get Bobby Robson in as his successor. Or weirdly, in fact, it's Ron Greenwood they go for, and it's another 4 or 5 years before Bobby Robson. So the manner in which it goes, and he misses a game, doesn't he? He misses a game, a friendly in Brazil, to go and apparently do some scouting when in fact he's finalising this contract. And then the news of the contract or the appointment is sold to the Mail or someone on one of the tabloids rather than being formally announced. That probably doesn't help. And, the FA reacted in a perfectly reasonable way and banned him from football for 10 years.
Yeah, there was quite a lengthy court case that took place. So, there was that automatic default. Well, Revie's asked to answer to a set of allegations about his conduct. Revie, perhaps understandably, refuses to do that because he thinks he would sit before a kangaroo court. Ultimately, maybe with an eye to kind of going back to Leeds, if not as manager, but there was an agreement when he left Leeds that he could become a consultant. Does come back. There's a kind of quasi-legal arrangement, which does look a little bit like a kangaroo court, to be honest, which I think ultimately goes to some kind of judicial review. And probably the tragedy of all of that was that after a reasonably successful time in the United Arab Emirates, there was never an opportunity for him to come back and to manage in England and try and either reclaim some of the success he had at Leeds or potentially translate that into other clubs. There was a suggestion at one point that he could have gone to Manchester City, perhaps a slightly more robust suggestion that he was going to become the QPR manager, but it just never happened. And instead, he ended up playing an awful lot of golf, to be honest.
Interestingly, it reminds me a bit, and this is completely a complete departure. It's not even. I thought it might be the same generation, but it's not even the same generation. But it's not the same subject at all. But it reminds me of Michael Powell, a very kind of successful filmmaker, Powell Emmerich Pressburger in the 50s, 60s, and so forth. And then he made this film, Peeping Tom, and the reaction, everyone was so outraged by it. You had this unbelievable director who basically didn't work again. He ended his career making Children's Film Foundation films, the kind of films you used to have to watch, these terrible kind of things. And this is a guy, and obviously Peeping Tom is now seen as a classic, and Last Night in Soho is an entire tribute to that film. But that period where we did appear, and I suppose we'll probably like it now as well, but society did seem to punish people quite sharply. And it is extraordinary, really, that he didn't come back in some way, and his reputation was never really restored. And, he's out there living a kind of Richard Keys, Andy Gray style lifestyle out in the Middle East.
Yeah, it really is trial by social media before trial by social media was a thing. It's and it's a travesty that someone with that incredible knowledge, with such a gift for the game, is sat on the sidelines and is unable to be used in some capacity. I mean, I can feel the appeal of going off and playing golf on a daily basis, but if you're a young manager or you're a young chairman and you want to do something with your football club and you know that there's this guy, Don Revie, on the benches that's not working, you've got to be tempted to tap into that. And it just feels like the public opinion would never allow that. And it was so strong that anyone who had the temptation just wouldn't do it because of the potential backlash because of Revie's irreparable damage that had been caused when he went off to the UAE, and did some really good stuff, as Phil mentioned.
And as I highlighted earlier, I mean, Roberto Mancini's done exactly the same for Italy, and people just shrug their shoulders and go, "Oh well, follow the money." You know, it's remarkably similar. We should get close to ranking this team. Before we do that, there's probably one last thing I think we probably should touch on, and that's probably one of the other things that maybe sullied his reputation, and that's there's various suggestions along the way that, you know, this man who wanted to win pretty much at all costs, which appeared through his meticulous planning, his carrying of lucky rabbit foots, might have also included the odd bonus payment along the line. There were some suggestions of a small hint of underworld activity, shall we say.
There is, if not underworld, then hints of or allegations of corruption that appear every now and again. Probably starting, if you go back to 1962, when Leeds are battling against relegation. Bury, who are managed by Bob Stokoe, are also battling against relegation. This allegation only really came to light in 1977, so it's in the middle of all of the controversy about Revie in England and the United Arab Emirates. But Stokoe alleged that Revie had said to him before a game, "I've got £500 in my pocket for you if you take it easy." And this was just before a potential relegation decider. And this was something that fired up Bob Stokoe over many, many years. Although it only kind of came out in 1977. He'd never buy a player from Revie, for example. Later on, there was an allegation in 1971 when Leeds needed to win against Nottingham Forest. This again came out in 1977, which isn't a coincidence, I don't think. Gary Sprake, the famous Leeds goalkeeper, the same goalkeeper who famously threw the ball into his own net for the own goal, the cop started singing Careless Hands. He suggested that Revie had sent Billy Bremner into the opposition, into the Nottingham Forest dressing room to, quote, say a few words. For me, there's two, and then maybe other allegations of payments that maybe shouldn't have been paid, for example. But they were strenuously denied, including by, for example, Billy Bremner, who suggested that actually Gary Sprake was rather put out, one, because he wasn't a very good goalkeeper, and secondly, because he'd been kind of sold to Birmingham City as well. But nothing was ever proven. There was a journalist who suggested that there was a dossier that he was going to publish, but that dossier never kind of came to light. So nothing was ever proven. Both Revie and the players repeatedly denied wrongdoing. There was lots of accusations, but no hard evidence. So I prefer to err on the side of innocence until proven guilty.
Absolutely. So where are we going to err on the side of greatness? Oh, that's a good link, that. I like that. So we have, as ever, we have 5 categories: greatness, all-time greats at the top, true greats, touch of greatness in the middle, edge of greatness, and right at the bottom, blinkered greats. Jamie, let's start with you. Where do you want to put this pretty complex story, Don Revie's Leeds United?
I think it's a tragedy of a story. I mean, it's littered with brilliance and success, but I think it's got more tragedy attached to it. In this 13-year period with Revie at the helm, they've won 2 Division 1 titles. They're runners-up 5 times. They've won 1 FA Cup. They're runners-up 3 times. They've won a League Cup. They're also runners-up on one occasion, and they're also both a winner of 2 Intercities Fair Cup, and they're still the current holders of the Intercities Fair Cup. That is a stat I've shared on this podcast many times, mostly because it is my favourite stat that Leeds United are the current holders of that tournament. And they also runners-up twice. And Don Revie never led his team to a European Cup final, and the closest he came, as Phil's covered, was the loss to Celtic in the semi-final. But the very first season he is not in charge of Leeds United, even with Brian Clough at the beginning, they go all the way to the European Cup final, where they meet the mighty Bayern Munich, And I think a lot of Leeds fans will probably say they were robbed. And if you look at some of the decisions taken on that day, they may have a case. They may be a bit whingy whiny, but they may have a case. And what's interesting about that final is that Duncan McKenzie, and you may remember, Graham, one of our super listeners, Cam Sharma, shared us a trivia question that Duncan McKenzie was the man who would jump over minis to win bets to top up his salary when he was playing football. He was Brian Clough's first signing at Leeds United, and he was in that team that went all the way to the 74-75 European Cup final against Bayern Munich. Jimmy Armfield was then the manager who replaced Brian Clough, and Jimmy Armfield, apparently, according to Duncan McKenzie, the man who jumps over minis, asked Don Revie to lead the Leeds United team out as a sentimental gesture, which wasn't taken up because obviously Don Revie wasn't the manager at the time, and at this moment he was with England, and it would have been very inappropriate, the current England manager walking out the Leeds United, the league champions of England, in the European Cup final. But also Duncan McKenzie claims that himself and Trevor Cherry, who were the new signings in that season, the young blood coming through, were both left out of the team. This is Duncan McKenzie's account, because of sentimentality towards the Revie team, and it was their last chance shot of glory. And who knows if you had a pretty good Duncan McKenzie and an amazing Trevor Cherry playing in that final where they've been playing most of the season. So I think Don Revie is a fascinating, complex character, he says, but his story, I think, is tragic. I think we are quite easily talking about one of the all-time greatest football teams of English football. But I'm not going to rank them there. I'm going to put them as true greats because I think they're the masters of their own demise as well. And I think Don Revie, for all his brilliance, his complexity, has possibly, and this is the controversial bit, has robbed Leeds United of more success than maybe they had one.
Oh, I love
That's
that.
my podcast career over, Graham.
Yeah, I like the controversy of that. Don Revie's Leeds would have been better without Don Revie, essentially. It hadn't occurred to me that Jimmy Armfield took over pretty much, not immediately, but obviously because Clough's reign was so short. And Jimmy Armfield, possibly the nicest man in football, should be managing dirty Leeds. Extraordinary. Phil, what about you? How do you rank them?
So I think this is the story of Revie and the impact that he had, which went probably beyond the trophies that were won by Leeds. He took a struggling, near bankrupt club, which had never won anything, and he turned them into a European superpower. And even today, 30 years after his kind of quite tragic death, Ellen Road is still a bit of a shrine to the man they refer to as the Don. The players still run out in their all white strip to the sound of Marching On Together, and they do that from the Don Revie stand. He developed and created a team as well that, I mean, you look at the kind of the core group of 9 players that were playing for him throughout his time at Leeds as Leeds manager. Norman Hunter, Paul Rooney, Peter Lorimer, Eddie Gray, Billy Bremner, Paul Madeley, backed up by much more experienced heads such as Jack Charlton and Bobby Collins, and later bringing in really exceptional players such as Johnny Giles. But when he left and he became England manager, he did leave what was then kind of quite an ageing squad, as Jamie's kind of touched on. Johnny Giles was soon to be 32, Bremner was nearly 30, Hunter was 29. I think possibly after the defeat in the 73 Cup final, there it is again, he thought he would have to replace key players, and perhaps he was just too sentimental to do that, maybe too close to the players to make some of those tough decisions. So definitely a great team, a touch of greatness. But I'm not sure they fall into the same bracket, let's say, as Manchester United, with Busby, or Liverpool with Shankly and later Paisley, where the team was reinvented on multiple occasions. They came close to the double, of course, and even the treble, but they fell short. And it's actually Arsenal who were the double winners in 1971. And there were multiple attempts after Revie has left to become an England manager to try and get the kind of gang together through managers such as Alan Clark, Eddie Gray, Billy Bremner, all becoming managers, but always falling short. And that was my first memory of Leeds as a kid, I think, in terms of this kind of conveyor belt of ex-Revie players becoming managers, but really never getting anywhere near the same success. So, yeah, I think definitely touch of greatness, but not quite up to the highest bracket, which might be hard. I'm incredibly sympathetic to Revie and the club and the amazing job he did, but they're just that little bit short, tiny bit.
It is a great story, I have to say. As you say, looking into it, a much more emotional story than I thought, and especially what happens with Don Revie, and I think the way he was treated. And actually, there's an irony. We did the Scotland 1978 World Cup squad under Ali McLeod a couple of weeks ago. A good pod. I do recommend you give that a listen to. And they're both stories of two managers who, admittedly, with slightly differing periods of work and that they achieved, but whose reputations were very harshly treated. The irony being, of course, that Don Revie introduced these dossiers and this great research into opposition teams, and Ali McLeod chose not to even watch Peru or Iran play. But anyway, that's another element to it. I do think, on the one hand, I think the word that absolutely sums him up is edge of greatness. That is what it is, because, for all that time, they didn't win as much as you thought they would win, and they almost won a huge amount more. Edge of greatness would be ridiculously harsh, given some of the other teams he put in there. I think we put Ronnie Radford's Hereford in there, so I think we have to acknowledge that Don Revie's Leeds are a different level. I think I agree with you both. It can't be all-time greats because of the lack of a European trophy and the lack of what they finally ran, and to some extent the lack of legacy. But it's definitely a true great for me, next level down, and that's earmarked by 90% of what Leeds have won ever is in that era. So Don Revie, Revie's Leeds United, true greats. Excellent. Well, we should probably wrap it up there, I think. Phil, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
We'll consider a team, around
South
the
Yorkshire.
West Yorkshire borders.
Yeah, we've got in South Yorkshire. Sheffield.
Yeah, it could go.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll go as far as Sheffield. Sheffield. Jamie, thank you for your time as ever.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you so much. And thanks again, Phil. I think the South Yorkshire one probably could be Hallam FC. We haven't done Hallam, so maybe a bit of history there. Huh? Who knows?
There you go. We like a bit of history.
So, as a quick reminder, you can listen to all our podcasts that we've done. We have now got a repertoire of, probably more than 30 by now. You can catch all of those in the podcast link or via chewingthewildrover.com. A reminder to subscribe to the podcast. You get a new one every Thursday. Got a few good ones coming up. I'll point in the direction of, talking of appalling pronunciations, Gornik Trabzia. Oh, I can't even pronounce it. We got a fantastic Polish team. Thank you. A fantastic Polish side. It's a story and a team you probably haven't heard of. I absolutely urge you to listen to. We had a brilliant guest, Pavel, on that, and it is really, really good. That's coming up. And if you missed it, we did Jose Mourinho's Porto last up, so you can listen to that. In the meantime, do drop us a line if there are any great teams you'd like us to have a go at, any great football superstitions, of course, out there, and we'll speak again soon.